To many people, action is probably the most important aspect of webtoons or manhwas. The most mainstream and popular webtoons are often praised for their action scenes more than storytelling or anything to do with such. On that front, my favorite webtoon Castle also offers a more than adequate dose of high-octane, insane action scenes throughout its story. And one thing that Castle does better than its contemporaries is making the action meaningful. The action is a culmination of escalating conflicts and tensions, its substance as much as it is style. And because of this reason, I would confidently argue that Castle has the best fight scenes out of any webtoon. And today, to further illustrate my point, I compiled the 10 very best fight scenes that the manhwa has to offer. The scenes I selected were based on 3 criteria. Does it tell an effective, potent story? Is the choreography great? And is the outcome/payoff great? Keep in mind that this is only my personal list, yours may vary, and mine could very well change once the manhwa is actually ended and we've seen fights like Mahagyeon and Gimshin or Pyujin and Gimshin. And with that, I'll proceed with the list. Full spoilers ahead for the entire series. Number 10. Sasaki Shingen versus Jihak. Jihak, the Sword of Hasong, taken on the strongest Yakuza in the Castle universe, is an instantly mouth-watering matchup for something like Castle, where the big matches usually deliver. And it did deliver, but I think this was a fight that could have benefited a lot from more breathing room and not trying to fit everyone into one arc. Jihak entering the fight already at like 1% HP was not fun, but otherwise this was a great read. Jihak's acrobatic style of fighting being hard countered by Shinken's long and wide swings was gorgeous to watch, and this match had a really strong story going into it, with this being the culmination of Ryu's arc. Jihak is your classic nonchalant, cold and distant kind of character, who might even be on the psychopathy spectrum, but this fight completely flips the narrative on his head by surprising both the reader and Ryu himself, revealing that after all, he did care deeply about his companions. He was subconsciously assuming responsibility for all of his fallen comrades, and really only became in tune with this part of himself in his final moments. Tragic, I know. And this sudden influx of emotions and passion kept him going in the face of an insurmountable wall that was Shinken. He just wouldn't stay down, at least until his job was finished anyways. The melodrama and tragedy of this fight, paired with a very appropriate theme from Doshi, gave this fight a beautiful ending stretch. I would have ranked it higher if they avoided the holdings fight altogether. Ryu having soloed the entire castle guards and several isekai killers going into this fight made the storytelling a bit lopsided, but the thematic weight of the ending still left a strong enough impression on me to include it on the list. Number 9. Pyujin vs Goonhyuk. I love this fight because it was an incredibly well-told story from start to finish. Pyujin encountered Goonhyuk for the first time ever early on in the story, as his first taste of what Castle truly has to offer, and he was thoroughly humiliated despite it being a 2v1. He barely escaped with his life intact, and from that moment on, Goonhyuk was used as a narrative wall Woojin was being scaled against, and the rematch really delivered. Going into the final fight, both characters were given a really good development. Woojin's best friend Dae Gun and Goonhyuk's childhood best friend Barista both ended up killing each other, and so the animosity and tragedy from that fight carried over to this fight, and both characters were out for blood heading into battle. Goonhyuk used to be a violent, savage, and downright animalistic fighter in his youth, and it's implied that his entry into Castle somewhat buried this side of him. He embraced the corporate side of things and put on a facade as an extremely well put together man and elegant individual in order to avoid his past. This was something that Barista himself even checked Goonhyuk for, like, hey, this side of you is fake, I know you, you've gone Hollywood now, huh? And ironically, Barista's death would be the trigger for Goonhyuk to flip the switch again. Goonhyuk and Woojin are also complete one-to-one narrative parallels to each other. Both grew up under similar conditions and were part of a trio of best friends who leaned on each other during tough times. This setup, plus with the circumstances of both having lost their best friends and Goonhyuk's special savage mode, made this feel like a shonen rivalry, but with a more violent, brutal twist. Definitely one of Part 1's best fights. Number 8. Gimshin vs Gustav 2. A David vs Goliath, but with a twist. What if David's agility, speed, and skill completely trumps Goliath's frightening strength, and the metaphorical roles were reversed? This fight was like a video game boss fight. The presentation and the choreography were amazing. The fight initially began inside a building and they fought their way out, literally breaking through a window and even fighting in air, and the fight eventually spilled into the nave of a church as the arena for their final swan song. I'm a sucker for these kind of things. The variety in locations really makes it feel like a boss fight with multiple stages to clear. It's very dynamic. Gustav has incredible strength, but Shin practically toys with him, because the sheer gap in their skill and precision is just far too wide. The flow of this fight is amazing, because you get to see Gustav become smarter as it goes on, somewhat starting to follow Shin in terms of battle IQ and technique. The way the narrative flips the cliche and makes the giant have to solve the small character instead really made it fun to watch. The only thing I didn't like about this fight is the fact that it came at the cost of Gustav's character development. I discussed this more at length in my previous video. Number 7. Shin vs Baek Dochan. The finale of Castle Season 1. I expect many people to rank this higher and even say this is their favorite, but for me it just falls a bit short in terms of creativity. You spend the entire Season 1 building to this occasion, but by the time you do reach it, you've already encountered several moments in the journey better than the destination. But that's not to say this fight wasn't good. I mean, it's still in my top 10 after all. So Shin finally meets the man who killed his father, and so the two virtually perfect killers do their dance. The choreography was mostly very smooth. It highlighted the sheer precision of their skill. The knife choreography is really gorgeous, and story-wise, it was basically just Shin climbing his personal narrative wall in terms of skill and experience. Baek Dochan was the mountain he had to scale, and this fight was just a process showing what he needed to overcome that wall. It told a story of Shin learning to detach himself from his emotions and almost achieving this assassin version of Ultra Instinct. That's basically what he did at the end. He beat Dochan by a hair's breadth and left the fight with some permanent injuries. I do really like the fight overall, but I think it's just a tad bit repetitive, and despite it being the finale, the two characters didn't click all that much for me personally in terms of chemistry, because Dochan honestly didn't even know who Shin was until they fought. But nevertheless, this was a very rewarding fight to watch, with a great payoff, especially for anyone who had followed Castle up to that point. Number 6. Aquila vs Gustav, Black Mamba, and Free Spirit. Aquila is a veteran of the Russian syndicate Isekura, who has become quite disillusioned with the way things have become under their Madame Lisa and her new ways. And this entire fight was a carefully laid trap specifically tailored to Aquila. The fight initially kicks off as a 1v1 between him and Gustav, and is great. It's like a western shootout plus anime mashup because of the location. Aquila's gruff southern man look and Gustav's fighting style is a fascinating blend. It was an explosive house match, but then they were interrupted by new recruits that also specialize in firearms. A new Free Spirit unit that's specifically built to be an anti-Aquila group. So this quickly turned into a match of battle IQ and Aquila having to navigate a tricky 1v4. But he manages to take out all three of the new recruits all at once before resuming battle with Gustav. And even then he almost did it still. But that's when Black Mamba, the slimiest, most evil Isekura member, returns to the scene with the head of Aquila's friend in his hand. And this made Aquila switch gears and turn his attention towards him. The final stretch of this fight has some of the most exhilarating and dynamic choreography that I have ever seen, as Aquila with his last breath tries to fire just one round into Black Mamba. He almost had him, but then Gustav begrudgingly interfered, and after that, Aquila knew his fate was sealed. He just smoked an imaginary cigarette and then went out like a G. This fight was incredible, because up to that point, Aquila was mostly a background character, but this fight put him over in such a big way and gave us some of the most cinematic and dynamic fight scenes in the entire series. Number 5. Barista vs Shin Tae-jin. This was one of the bleakest fights of the entire manhwa. In a nutshell, Barista and Shin Tae-jin are both killers associated with Castle, but Shin Tae-jin still has somewhat of a moral compass, and he is someone who is utterly disgusted with the things that he has done. To say he's suicidal would be an understatement. Barista, on the other hand, while he still has people he genuinely cares about, is a true professional through and through. And to someone like him, Shin Tae-jin is nothing but a hypocrite. The two particularly shares a bitter history where they were both present during a mission, and the order was simply to kill everything in sight. And Shin Tae-jin ran into a family of hunters that actually have nothing to do with their target. He did kill their parents, but he wanted to spare the kid. But Barista insisted otherwise, and that they tie up all loose ends, which led to an extremely tense moment, and things even got physical, and Barista had to step down. And he never quite forgot that one incident, and their real fight that happens years after this event really stings because that is right after Shin Tae-jin actually found some newfound will to live, thanks to Kim Shin and his companions. He was traveling around and actually looking forward to starting anew. He just so happened to run into Barista somewhere in Southeast Asia, and so he instead opted to repay his debt to Kim Shin. This coincidence feels quite cruel, but also fitting for Shin Tae-jin and his life of sins. He also found out during the fight that the kid also took his own life, so after that, he knew there was no future for him, even if he briefly considered a second life. And you get this amazing intro line too, where he says, "Let it stand to benefit the earth today, as two demons cease to exist." This fight was a masterpiece in terms of character psychology. Even the small fries that Barista throws at Shin Tae-jin are starving and desperate locals who would take up any job. He does this purely to mess with Shin Tae-jin's head. And visually, the fight is very refreshing because it takes place in some Southeast Asian slum city, so you get more of a Narcos cartel drama side of Castle, and aesthetically is a very welcome change. Unfortunately, Shin Tae-jin lost, and even then, Jonghyun didn't let him go peacefully. The locals took everything off of his body, and it was a pitiful sight. I really like that the author kept it consistent, that while some sympathy can be spared for Shin Tae-jin, he still did the things he did and deserved to pay the appropriate price. Number 4. Dohwa vs Pyongyang, Hide, Black Mamba, and Namilho. I think this is easily the most epic boss fight that the series has to offer, and it upstaged the actual Season 1 final fight. What made this fight so great is that in that moment, it felt as if nothing was supposed to be quote-unquote fair. During this fight, the world of Castle felt like something real that doesn't favor any one side, like a fictional story typically does. So Uno Toshiro, also known as Dohwa, is a legendary mixed-blood Yakuza, and technically this fight was supposed to be a big payoff for the character Pyongyang, whose father was killed by Dohwa. So this is his big crowning moment where he avenges his father, but instead of trying to solve the power gap between the two, author Jonghyun simply makes multiple characters jump Dohwa and merge a couple of stories together, which worked out wonderfully. Pyongyang had to team up with someone that's arguably worse than Dohwa in Black Mamba, and this guy was an interesting variable in the fight. You don't know if he was gonna fire at the enemy or you. Hide and Dohwa also have plenty history in Japan as two mixed-race Yakuzas, and this was just a beautiful, messy, and violent culmination of all of those stories, and everyone got to shine. Dohwa is often praised as Season 1's most charismatic character, because he's ultra-violent, but at the same time he has this charming rockstar-like energy, and even a sense of humor to him. Even in his older days, he really looked out for other diaspora, and when he loves someone he really gives the shirt off his back for them. And this character depth and duality was on full display here. Throughout the fight he was an unrelenting demon, and even the 4v1 was barely enough to really put him down for good. And even when he did eventually go down, rather than his own life, he was thinking of his best friend Takebayashi Isao or Imuyol. Loyalty, violence, brotherhood, melodrama. If all the best tropes of a noir story can be expressed in a single character, is Dohwa. Number 3. Kim Dae Gun vs Barista. A prequel as well as a sequel to two of our previous picks respectively. This fight took place not long after Shin Tae-jin was taken out and Barista touched down in Korea. This is that classic scenario where the relatively weak side character clutches and go on a Linsanity run, but you know they're cooked after the fight. What makes this fight so moving is that you actually get to see Kim Dae Gun hesitate. He saw his companions being tortured, and yet he still wanted to walk away and wait for backup. This is realistic. And this adds an extra layer of tension and stakes when his good and heroic nature took over and he still rushed inside anyways. In my opinion, this is the most tense castle fight ever, because you legitimately don't know how Kim Dae Gun can pull it off. Every hit from Barista feels like it could spell the end for Kim Dae Gun. Castle's portrayal of an underdog uphill struggle is extremely cruel, unforgiving, and exhausting. Like, this downright apocalyptic scenario couldn't have happened to a nicer person. And the ending is especially depressing because Kim Dae Gun does win, just for Baek Dochan to show up at the 11th hour and one-shot kill him. It makes the whole fight feel so cruel and bleak, but nonetheless very appropriate with what Castle is usually known to do. Number 2. Yu-sung vs Seo Jin-tae. This could easily place as first. The actual number 1 and this fight is really interchangeable just depending on my mood. This fight was a brilliant portrayal of pure hate, disdain, and two characters who genuinely can't stand each other's existence. Yu-sung is someone who was betrayed by his only friend, and as a result, picked up this belief in life that loyalty simply doesn't exist. But then he got involved with Seo Jin-tae over a separate incident related to his brother, and Seo Jin-tae is someone who is willing to die for Kim Shin at any time, and someone who would never in any circumstances betray Kim Shin. And this pisses Yu-sung off. It feels like a big middle finger to his worldview and beliefs. The incident involving his brother may be a convenient excuse, but this is the real reason he wants to kill Jin-tae. There are a lot of things to like about this fight, but one scene in particular, the elevator scene, a homage to the film New World, is simply jaw-dropping. I legitimately don't understand how someone can even draw something like it. It's unbelievably good. And lastly, number 1, the best fight in all of Castle so far is Kim Shin versus Lee Chen. This is kind of a curveball, and it's really funny. If I were to really judge this fight with the aforementioned criteria I have set to determine what's a good fight, this technically doesn't deserve the number 1 spot. But this fight delivered in one aspect to such an otherworldly degree that alone overrides everything else. It pretty much broke my scale. It turned into something that exists outside of my usual system of judgment. The story behind the fight is extremely simple. Lee Chen is Yu-sung's mentor, and the only person he can hire that holds a candle to Kim Shin, so he carefully placed Lee Chen to lure Kim Shin out, and thus the two fought. What makes this fight so absurdly good is the presentation of it. From the moment he showed up, Lee Chen looks almost identical to Kim Shin, and he even fights like Kim Shin. Lee Chen was essentially just an excuse for Jonghyun to draw a pure, unadulterated hand-to-hand, knife-to-knife mirror match for Kim Shin. And because of that, this fight manages to do the opposite of what other Castle fights do. Instead of personal animosity or a deep connection between the two characters, this was just like Assassin's Olympics. It turned into a dance performance of sorts. It's smooth, it's elegant, it's technical, and just beautiful. This was like Jonghyun saying, let me just quickly come up with a lore excuse to draw the best possible fight I can from a visual standpoint. Put the story aside for a bit. From a purely visual and art standpoint, what's the most enthralling fight I can draw for the series? Kim Shin versus someone who strangely looks just like him, but Chinese and with a scar. Perfect. The story here is quite bare bones, so I'm really breaking my own non-negotiable rules here, but you know what they say. There's an exception to every rule, and this just happens to be mine. And still, this fight isn't completely devoid of a story. Jonghyun still managed to tell a punchy cautionary tale with Lee Chen. Lee Chen is someone who swears by the approach of remaining in the shadows. Unlike other Castleverse characters, he doesn't have much of a reputation or infamy. In fact, he looks down on people who do, questioning their professional status. And this approach has gotten him far enough that he's at least top 8 in the entire verse. So there is a method to his madness. But this also means that he's never had to grind it out against a superior opponent, barely survive and then grow. He's very strong, but his natural talent likely carried him to such a degree. So when he actually encounters an opponent like Kim Shin, who he really isn't that far behind, he completely collapses psychologically just because he never accounted for a scenario where he'd be on the ropes. And it is poetic because the guy who swears by remaining in the shadows was the same guy desperately reaching for the light in his final moments. And that's my pick for the top 10 best fights that the Castle Webtoon has to offer. These are just my personal selections, your opinion will most likely differ. If you disagree, feel free to comment your own list. These are just what I determine to be the best representatives of the kind of action you can expect from Castle. Thanks for watching, and peace.